He was definitely a nice-looking, fine guy. His eyes was beautiful. His smile just lit up a room. My mom came running down the stairs and let me know that my brother had passed. So I was kind of in shock, not really registering it. It didn't make sense to me.
He was gasping for air. He was foaming at the mouth.
They were immediately struck by a very strong smell of bleach.
I've been on hundreds of crime scenes. We've seen it all. I'd never seen anything like this before.
Crimes like these are usually from somebody you know, somebody you're close with, somebody intimate.
There was a lot of talk in the neighborhood of this girl going around pretty much bragging.
She said what happened to him was payback.
She gets upset, something happens, and she uses violence.
She, in fact, was proud that she had won the fight.
2017, when Chicago PD receives a call from the Inglewood neighborhood on the city's south side.
On March 6, 2017, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, there was a 911 call from a woman who was calling for help to the 6500 block of South Bishop Street.
She tells them that her friend Darius, who's 26 years old at the time, is at her door and he is foaming at the mouth and can barely breathe.
The victim made his way up to the second floor apartment.
He was in the hallway on the ground. They let him in and he crawled inside and lay on his back. The Chicago Fire Department was the first to arrive on scene. They found Darius Ellis stretched out on the ground, difficulty breathing. He was foaming from the mouth, his eyes were streaming, and his face was blue, like he was lacking oxygen.
The first responders notice a familiar but toxic odor.
There was an overpowering smell of bleach.
The Chicago Police Department ambulance immediately transported Darius to Stroger Hospital, which is one of our best level 1 trauma hospitals.
Darius Ellis was born in 1990 and raised in Inglewood. He grew up with his 10 siblings nearby.
We have a big family. We all grew up around each other. My father made it very clear that he wanted us to be close, so the age gap between me and Darius is only 3 years. My mom likes to call us two peas in a pod. We grew up about 4 blocks away from each other. For quite some time, his mom stayed literally maybe 4 to 5 blocks away from my mother, and we were there for 15 plus years. So we were very close, like, to each other. We would hang out every day. He would say I was his little big sister because of the way I treated him. He would literally be reluctant to tell me things if he did something wrong. That's how much I was more of the serious one, the one that really wanted him to, like, just be his best.
In the 90s, Inglewood was a close-knit community.
We could play all night with no issues, like, till the streetlights came on. We played basketball in the alleys with crates and played it and rode bikes and were able to just be kids at one point. And it seemed like at the drop of a dime, everything shifted and we had to worry about shootings and, a lot more violent things.
As Darius grew older, he took an interest in working out and weightlifting.
He's always been really active. He would lift weights. He didn't need to go to a gym. He could set up right at home, and he would just get busy. And then the next thing you know, we're getting a blast of pictures with his shirt off. So he had to show off those muscles, those pecs. He would be flexing. He was just proud of the progress he was making,
His physique, combined with his natural good looks, made Darius popular with the ladies.
The ladies loved him. He loved them back. He was fun, outgoing, easy.
And I definitely will say women seen how attractive he was. And when he met his baby mother, he actually told me about her after she got pregnant.
At 21 years old, Darius became a father.
Darius' life changed, I feel like, drastically when he had his son. I feel like when he had his child, it gave him purpose. That love I feel like immediately when Darius had his kid, he made that decision to make sure that he would be in this kid life every day, show up every day, because it was important, because we knew how it was to not have that. That void in our heart, I feel like pushed him to just be the best. He just wanted to be the best he could be for his kid. He was a welder. He was getting into the construction business. Him and another one of my brothers as well. They both were kind of like going tit for tat with that. That was their interest.
Darius worked on various construction projects throughout the city.
I remember him telling me about it and just being like, man, sis, I'm doing construction and it's going really well. I did this big project. Like, he was just happy about it, and I was proud of him, you know, just seeing him go for something that he loved doing.
He was well on his way to making himself known in that industry.
His relationship with his son's mother didn't last. In 2015, Darius met 22-year-old Yasmin Elder.
When they met, Yasmin wasn't really interested in Darius. She thought that he was a player. She thought that he had a lot of women. And so she didn't really want to invest her time there. But eventually, he was able to charm her, wear her down, and they entered into this relationship.
Yasmin was a bright spot, but 2017 brought big challenges as well.
He was a welder, but he was living in his van at the time, in between jobs, just down on his luck.
With welding and stuff, it's only certain projects you can get. So I feel like it kind of fell slow for a little bit for him. So he was struggling. Here's the thing though, Darius always have somewhere to go. He could come to my home, open arms, without a problem. And he knew that, he was aware. I just think he was just one of those strong-willed men that didn't want to budge on, asking anybody for too much help. He just didn't want to be a burden. He was a strong man. He wanted to be a man. He was dealing with things.
On March 6th, Darius is rushed to a local trauma center after showing up at a friend's apartment, foaming at the mouth and reeking of bleach. Doctors spend 2 hours trying to save him.
Unfortunately, it's too late. At 3:26 in the morning, Darius is pronounced dead at the hospital.
I was working as a detective assigned to Area 2, and our office received a phone call about a death investigation from 7th District personnel, and they stated they had a deceased victim at Stroger Hospital. I arrived in the early morning hours. It was probably around 4:00 a.m. And I went to the emergency room where I spoke to the doctor about the details of the deceased, and he stated that the victim had some type of caustic substance poured onto his face and his nose area. He said that the caustic substance that was in his nose and mouth would have burned his throat and caused it to swell, thereby causing him to suffocate.
In the morgue, detectives get confirmation as to what that substance was.
They opened up the body bag and were immediately struck by a very strong smell of bleach. Police detectives inspected Darius's clothing, and there was a very strong odor of bleach. They immediately inventoried that property.
I took the clothing out of the bag to examine it, and I came across a black hooded sweatshirt that had a distinct spill pattern around the neck area, and it was discolored orange from the black. And through my rubber gloves, I could feel that the clothing was completely soaked. Because of the large amount of bleach involved, this led me to believe that this was not self-inflicted, that we had a murder on our hands.
The detective was able to determine that this was foul play pretty much immediately.
This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And who the hell would do this to someone? It just leaves you speechless.
In the early morning hours of March 6th, 2017. 26-year-old Darius Ellis dies at a Chicago hospital after showing up at a friend's apartment in distress.
When the detective talked to the doctor said there was extensive damage done to the inside of his mouth and his throat from bleach, and the initial cause of death was asphyxiation.
The police were able to recognize that this was foul play.
I spoke to the patrol officers that were at the hospital. They gave me the particulars of the case, provided me with the name of the victim and the location of where they believe the crime may have occurred. So I finished my investigation at the hospital at that time and then relocated to the crime scene. I went up to the second floor apartment on Bishop and I spoke to a witness who turned out to be a friend of the victim, Darius Ellis.
In the apartment, we have 3 adults. We have Darius's friend, and we have the son of Darius's friend and his girlfriend.
These were the witnesses in the house who helped Darius when he knocked on the door asking for help.
Around 12:30 in the evening, Darius's lady friend heard a knock on her apartment door. And she proceeded to the door and heard Darius whisper in a raspy voice through the door, "It's me, Darius."
When she opens the door, she sees her friend Darius lying outside of her apartment on the ground, arms spread, legs spread, gasping for air.
She could hear his labored breathing. She could see that there was just a white foamy substance coming from his mouth. But what was so surprising and just astounding was that the aroma that was coming from him. And there was just that overwhelming stench of some type of cleaning chemical.
Darius tried to speak.
He told her that 2 men had held him down and poured bleach into his face.
He quickly became unable to talk, but his friend noticed he was still trying to communicate with her.
Darius couldn't talk because he was struggling to breathe, but he held up a cell phone and showed it to this woman. She did not know what he meant by this gesture, but she did know that this cell phone did not belong to Darius.
At that point, the friend became too concerned about Darius's health to try and understand what he was communicating.
She realizes very quickly that Darius is getting worse, so she has no choice but to call 911.
She points out that the flip phone was left behind when Darius was loaded into the ambulance.
The police are able to recover a few things. They get his cell phone, and they also get this flip phone, and they're able to also get his car keys.
Darius's friend says that his silver minivan is still parked in front of her building.
She informed the police of what he had been doing. Lately, he's trained as a welder, but he had been in between jobs and unfortunately living in his van.
I was able to obtain the keys to Darius's minivan, and upon opening it, I was instantly overwhelmed with a very strong odor of bleach. It was so strong that I was unable to investigate the interior of the vehicle without going back to my squad car and getting a mask.
Once inside the minivan, police noticed large amounts of liquid on the windshield, on the passenger seat, and on the floor. Immediately, the police called for an evidence technician to have him swab the liquid and take photographs.
I noticed a spill pattern on the front seats of the vehicle, which caused a discoloration to the darker interior, making it orange in appearance, which matched the same spill pattern I saw on Darius's hooded sweatshirt in the hospital. Upon examining inside the vehicle, there was numerous items strewn about, clothing, and a liquid substance was all over the windshield, the seats, the floorboards, the ceiling, which was indicative of a struggle in a close quarters area.
The detective is able to confirm that this is definitely the scene of the crime.
While it's clear a struggle took place in the van, investigators don't believe Darius's claim that he was attacked by two large men.
Seeing the interior of the minivan and how cluttered it was, there was no way two big guys were pinning him down inside a minivan. The statement he made to the witnesses and the patrolman's reports led me to believe that he was trying to cover for someone.
In March of 2017, Chicago detectives are in the Inglewood neighborhood investigating the bizarre death of 26-year-old Darius Ellis. After processing the van where they suspect Darius was forced to drink bleach, they scour the area for evidence.
We were looking for a carton or something, type of container that could hold the bleach, and we checked the garbage cans nearby, we checked the empty lot.
Before they leave, they ask Darius's friend who the single father spent time with.
She responded that Darius had a history of being a ladies' man, but that lately he had actually been dedicating all of his time and energy to one woman in particular, 24-year-old Yasmin.
Yasmin lived a few blocks away. She was a few years younger than he was. She was living with her relatives, an uncle, her grandparents.
Before they talk to Yasmin, investigators learn that the Cook County medical examiner has completed Darius's autopsy.
The doctors concluded that the pH level in Darius's stomach was at 12 to 13, which is more than double the amount of a normal human's pH level.
The chemical makeup or whatever of bleach would cause your throat and mouth to swell so quickly that instantly closes like a fist and you die from suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He died because he got asphyxiated. His findings were that Darius's death was caused by the forced administration of a caustic substance. It's officially ruled a homicide. I've been on hundreds of crime scenes before. Big city detective, we've seen it all. I'd never seen anything like this before. This was murder with bleach. Unusual.
Poison.
As far as who could be responsible, Darius's family is at a loss.
Darius didn't have any enemies. He got along with his ex, he had a close relationship with his son.
To be honest with you, I don't even understand what motive anyone would have to want to poison someone and kill them.
Later that day, detectives ask the woman who called 911 to come to the station for a follow-up interview. She relays a troubling story.
The friend told police that on the night of the incident, when Darius was taken to the hospital, that she walked down to Darius's family's home so that she could relate to them what had happened. On her way to their home, she ran into Yasmin Elder.
She stopped and she informed Yasmin of what had happened to Darius, and Yasmin's response, she laughed. Darius's friend also said that then Yasmin said, as she was laughing, he shouldn't have put his hands on me.
Yasmin's reaction to what happened to Darius and the state that he was in, the laughter is, it's troublesome.
The police asked Darius' friend if she noticed that Yasmin had any injuries on her body. Darius's friend stated that, nope, not to her. She didn't see that there were any injuries noted on Yasmin's body, but did say that Yasmin made mention that bleach had gotten into her eyes and that they were burning.
She doesn't know her last name, but tells police Yasmin lives in the neighborhood and has been in trouble with the law before.
The woman let police know that Yasmin wouldn't be hard to find. She has a distinguishable tattoo on her neck. She does have a past with law enforcement, so she's in the system.
I told my supervisor, I got a hot case going here, and it's domestic related, and we could probably solve it right now. I'm going to ask for help from the day's violent crimes guys. And they helped me out. I threw out that name Yasmin. 4-block area where she lives and a tattoo on her neck. That's when Civisec put the parameters in, and within 1 minute we came back with that picture.
Investigators find one woman who matches all those criteria. 24-year-old Yasmin Elder.
I was able to pull up Yasmin's arrest photo because just recently she was arrested for battery.
She had been accused of using a metal lock to hit her landlord in the head during a dispute. They find that she's currently on court supervision.
Yasmin now has an established history of being violent. It's sounding like that she gets upset, something happens, and she uses violence.
They take Yasmin's picture to Darius's friend.
Based on all of the information that the police had, they put together a photo lineup and they showed it to the woman, and the woman immediately pointed Yasmin out.
After the witnesses picked Yasmin out of a photo array, we now had probable cause to effect an arrest.
As Chicago police look into the gruesome death of 26-year-old Darius Ellis, they learn of incriminating statements made by his girlfriend, Yasmin Elder, in the hours after he died.
Yasmin laughed and said to the friend, "He shouldn't have put his hands on me."
Based on all of the information that detectives were finding out about Yasmin, her law enforcement past, the troubles that she's had, the court supervision, the battery charge, it was beginning to look more and more like maybe she did have something to do with this and we need to talk to her immediately.
As investigators prepare to bring Yasmin in, they know that connecting her to the crime could rest in a clue Darius offered just before he lost consciousness.
He couldn't speak, so what he did was he had a phone in his hand, he held it up, and they knew that the phone wasn't his.
He was holding a phone in his hand. When they asked, "Who did this to you? What happened?" all Darius could do was point to the phone in his hand.
The key to the whole case was Darius holding up that phone.
Armed with an arrest warrant, police head back to Inglewood to look for Yasmin.
So we quickly went to the last known address where we believed Yasmin was staying, which was her grandmother's house. Yasmin wasn't home at the time, but her grandmother did state she was staying there. After speaking with the grandmother, we were able to have her sign a consent to search form in order to search the area where Yasmin was staying, looking for evidence.
They're able to go into Yasmin's room and do a search, and what do they find? They find a pair of black pants that are covered in red stains that seem like bleach stains.
Speaking to the grandmother stated those were the clothes she wore the night before when she came home and changed. We seized the pair of pants and had them recovered by an evidence technician to test the liquid stain on the pants.
Yasmin's grandmother doesn't know where she is.
We told her we'd like to speak with Yasmin, and we left our business card with her, and then we left.
Word hits the street that the police are looking for Yasmin. But the rumors are already running wild.
It was a lot of things being said in that neighborhood. Like I said, everything was close. It was a lot of talk in the neighborhood of this girl going around pretty much bragging about it. I don't think any of us knew about Yasmin. I've never met her. So I didn't know, I had no recollection of this lady whatsoever. I didn't know who she was, to be honest. I didn't know anything of her into this situation. But we were looking for her, essentially. Like, we were trying to get her in custody. We were trying to figure out what this woman was.
Time was very important because we were afraid that she might try to flee the state or flee whatever because she has to know she's a wanted person.
It appears that Yasmin does know that she is being sought after by police.
Several hours later, we were contacted by Yasmin saying she was willing to speak with us.
After getting that call from Yasmin, police immediately went to her home and arrested her.
She was very cooperative, turned herself in. Yasmin was transported to detective headquarters where she was placed in an interview room and placed under video and audio surveillance. She was Mirandized, stated she understood her rights, and she was willing to speak with the detectives.
Detectives have a lot of questions for Yasmin.
In my entire career, there are very few incidences of people dying from ingestion of bleach.
It's just not understandable. Bleach. This is what killed this man. Bleach was poured down his throat. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And who the hell would do this to someone?
After Darius Ellis dies from forcibly ingesting bleach, Chicago detectives question the main suspect, his girlfriend, Yasmin Elder.
So once the police arrest Yasmin, they ask her what was the relationship like between her and Darius.
They were on and off, they saw each other, but it wasn't serious. About a month before the incident, they decided to get serious, and they were in fact engaged to be married.
Yasmin told detectives that she and Darius had been dating on and off since 2015, but at the beginning of 2017, they finally decided to get engaged.
But instead of happiness, the decision brought instant drama.
Darius and Yasmin both were experiencing some insecurities around the relationship. Even though they were supposed to be committed, they both were in fear that there were other people involved on both of their sides. Yasmin believed that Darius was a ladies' man. Darius had caught Yasmin texting an ex-boyfriend and had some insecurities around that. Yasmin was also very upset that in 2 years she had never met his family and they were about to get married.
It just became a toxic relationship. He just became so much more enraged, so much more jealous. He would accuse her of cheating, and sometimes he got physically abusive, according to Yasmin.
Yasmin told police that the physical violence had increased over the last 2 weeks prior to the incident. That in fact, 5 days prior to the incident, while at a laundromat with Darius, that Darius caught her texting her ex-boyfriend on her cell phone. Darius became so enraged that he choked her.
When detectives asked Yasmin why she didn't report any of this domestic abuse before, she said that she was under supervision for a fight that she had unrelated to this incident and was afraid that police just wouldn't believe her.
She says that by the night of his death, tension between them was high.
Yasmin told police that on the night of the incident, Darius had picked her up around 12:30 a.m. on the morning of March 6th. During their ride home, Darius became enraged because she was in fact texting the ex-boyfriend again during the ride.
He pulled over, came out of the car, ripped her out of the car, and threw her to the ground. Yasmin says she got up again, but he grabbed her and threw her down a second time. Yasmin told detectives that she was screaming for help and that Darius picked her up and forced her back into the van.
And she tries to call 911, and he knocks the phone out of her hand.
Yasmin told detectives that during the fight, Darius bit her hand, grabbed both her arms, punched her in the thigh, and in the back of the head. Darius pulled over, and now it was a physical altercation. He was punching her, he tried getting on top of her, but Yasmin grabbed his hair and was pulling him and eventually got him on the ground between the seats.
Yasmin stated she was able to overpower Darius by pulling him to the ground by his hair and then pinning him there with her knee using her weight. She also made a statement that she said, "At this time, I was winning the fight."
Saying things like, "I'm winning this fight," implies that in this moment, Yasmin felt vindicated in what she was doing. She felt like, maybe you've done this to me before, and this time it's not gonna happen. I'm gonna win. I'm gonna stand up for myself.
When police asked Yasmin how she was able to overpower Darius, she told police that she weighs 207 pounds, and at the time of Darius's death, he weighed 130 pounds.
The fight continued into the back seat of the minivan, at which time Darius swung a plastic bottle at her that she said contained bleach, but she blocked it.
Yasmin wasn't sure if Darius was attempting to hit her with a bleach bottle or attempting to splash her with the bleach.
Yasmin feels like she has to fight. She's in survivor mode. So while Yasmin's knee is still on Darius's waist, she's able to gain control of the bleach and take it away from Darius. At this point, she starts to pour the bleach all into Darius's mouth.
Yasmin related she then jumped out of the minivan and heard him gasping and trying to breathe. And he called out to her, "I can't breathe, I need to go to the hospital."
She, despite hearing this, continues to walk away. And a moment later, she states that he got behind the wheel and drove off.
Yasmin related that she walked for a little while and then got onto a bus and went back to her neighborhood.
After all the questioning during the interrogation, it never came across to me that Yasmin was fearful for her life. It almost seemed like she was in control of this fight the entire time and could put an end to it anytime she wanted to. Not once during the interrogation did she ever say she was fighting in self-defense. She said, "He started hitting me, and I fought back, and I was winning."
She, in fact, was proud of the fact that she had won the fight.
In Chicago PD's Area South Detective Division, Yasmin Elder has just admitted that she was in a physical fight with her fiancé the night he died.
Yasmin stated as the fight went on that Darius grabbed a plastic bottle containing bleach and he went to hit her with it. She stated she was able to obtain this bottle somehow, at which time she used it to pour into his mouth.
Yasmin claims the fight came after suffering abuse at Darius's hands in the weeks and minutes before the fight.
Police asked Yasmin about any injuries that she might have received. She told police that she had gotten bleach in her eyes, that Darius had bit her on her hand, and that he had punched her in her thighs, as well as had hit her in the back of the head.
After speaking with Yasmin and the statement she made about receiving injuries from Darius, we photographed various parts of her body, and none of the photographs revealed any type of injury. There was one bruise on her thigh, and we also noticed a red mark on her hand that we believed was a burn from a caustic substance.
There are no bite marks on her body. There are no obvious signs of a struggle. There's nothing around her eyes to substantiate these claims.
Nor is there any proof that Darius ever laid a hand on her.
We didn't see anything that would indicate that happened. And why hadn't she ever made a police report before? Why hadn't she told anyone else before?
But the most powerful moment in the interview with Yasmin comes when detectives present her with the flip phone Darius held up in his final dying moments.
When presented with the evidence of the flip phone, Yasmin agreed that it was indeed her phone. Darius, in essence, solved his own murder.
Investigators now believe that Darius's initial claim he was attacked by two men was an attempt to save Yasmin.
When he thinks he's going to survive, he wants help, but he's not going to tell him that was his fiancée, Yasmin. So he says there was two black guys who held me down. He didn't think he was going to die. He just wanted help. He didn't want her locked up.
But then Darius realized his situation was more serious than he thought.
They didn't want to get her in trouble at first, but as he's dying and he realizes he's dying, he then tells the truth. The state's attorney's office interviewed witnesses and reviewed reports and all the evidence, and on May 7th, 2017, charged Yasmin Elder with one count of first-degree murder.
First-degree murder charges in Illinois carry a minimum of 20 years in prison up to 60 years in prison. First-degree murder requires intent.
Yasmin's bail is set at $1 million.
I do recall my brother letting me know. He did make us all aware that she was in custody.
Darius's family is stunned by the truth and by Yasmin's claims that she and Darius were engaged.
If they were planning to be married, one of us would have known. Darius is close to his siblings. Me, my brothers, we all spoke frequently on the phone. Whether we seen each other or not, we talked. We were very close. So if he was planning any type of engagement or proposing to someone, I definitely feel like we would have known. You say that you guys are engaged and you were shopping for a wedding dress and all of these great things. Why would you want to poison someone that you love?
On February 13th, 2020, Yasmin pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
The negotiation between her lawyer and the prosecutors in this case resulted in a plea agreement of 15 years, which was 5 years below the maximum sentence that could be had in second degree.
We held up our end of the bargain as the Chicago Police Department. We did a thorough investigation. We put the facts together, and we put a person in prison who committed the murder.
When Yasmin ran into Darius's friend, what she told the friend was that Darius should not have put his hands on me, that what happened to him was payback for what he had in fact done to her.
I think that her response of he shouldn't have put his hands on me was a person that is trying to justify something that they did. Like, no one has proof of Darius ever putting his hands. She didn't have any markings on her body. She didn't have any bruises, any of those things. This is a strong man. If he's putting his hands on you, you will have something to show for it. You had none of that. So at that point, I think that it was her way of just giving people a reason. Oh, this is why I did it. So it could be justified maybe as payback. This is why I did it. But I really feel like it's not payback from him abusing her. I think it's payback from him denying her and her being jealous of what he had going on.
Not once did I ever feel that she felt guilty about what happened.
But for the people who love Darius, the justice is short-lived.
Yasmin Elder received time credit for serving 31 months prior to her trial and was released on parole in May 2024.
She should have not only served 6.5 years. She killed my brother in cold blood.
In spite of Yasmin's release, the Ellis family continues to honor Darius's memory.
You lose a lot when you lose someone, and the Englewood community, Darius's family, they all lost a great human being.
He embodied.
The freeway looked endless after midnight. Under the pale glow of scattered streetlights, ribbons of asphalt stretched across Southern California like dark rivers, carrying restless travelers toward places they hoped to reach before sunrise. Headlights flashed past each other in brief moments of silent recognition, strangers crossing paths for no more than a heartbeat before disappearing into the darkness again. It was the kind of road where people believed they were anonymous, where every passing vehicle became another forgotten face in an endless stream of motion. For many, those highways represented freedom. For others, they became the last road they would ever travel. Long before investigators gave him a nickname that newspapers would repeat for years, before television crews gathered outside courtrooms and before prosecutors stacked photographs of young victims across courtroom tables, there was only a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Teenage boys began disappearing. One after another. Some had run away from difficult homes. Some had accepted rides while trying to get across California. Others were simply walking, believing that the next passing vehicle might save them hours of walking beneath the relentless California sun. They vanished quietly, leaving behind bedrooms with unmade beds, unfinished conversations, bicycles leaning against fences, parents waiting for phone calls that would never come, and friends who slowly realized that missing was becoming something far more frightening. At first, no one connected the disappearances. Southern California was enormous. Millions of people traveled its highways every week. Police departments worked within their own jurisdictions, filing reports that rarely crossed county lines unless absolutely necessary. A missing teenager in one city did not automatically become the concern of detectives 2 counties away. Every department saw only one piece of a much larger puzzle. And somewhere between those invisible borders, someone understood exactly how to exploit the gaps. He knew the highways. He knew how quickly people disappeared inside a city built around movement. He knew which exits were quiet after midnight. He knew where abandoned roads met empty fields, where construction sites remained deserted until dawn, where discarded bodies might remain unnoticed long enough for rain, traffic, wildlife, and time to erase the first fragile traces of violence. He also understood something even darker. He knew which young people the world was least prepared to search for. Many of his victims were teenagers living on the edges of society. Some had unstable homes. Some drifted from city to city. Others trusted strangers because they had little choice. Every decision they made carried risk, but survival often demanded accepting risks that most people would never consider. A ride from a stranger. One night inside an unfamiliar car. The promise of food. The promise of work. The promise of simply getting closer to wherever they believed life might finally improve. Most drivers passed without slowing. One did. Witnesses would later remember ordinary details that suddenly became unforgettable. A van parked along the roadside. A driver who appeared calm. A conversation lasting only seconds before the passenger climbed inside. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing suggested terror. Nothing warned that those few ordinary moments were quietly dividing a young life into 2 parts. Before entering the vehicle. And never being seen alive again. That was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case. There were no dramatic kidnappings in crowded parking lots. No screaming crowds. No shattered windows. No desperate car chases. The disappearances often unfolded with terrifying simplicity. A vehicle slowed. A door opened. Someone climbed inside. Then the highway swallowed them. Families searched in the ways families always do. They called friends. They contacted relatives. They searched neighborhoods. They walked familiar streets hoping to catch a glimpse of a familiar face. Every ringing telephone carried hope. Every knock at the door interrupted sleep. Every unfamiliar car outside the house sparked another impossible question. Could this finally be them? Hours turned into days. Days became weeks. Eventually calendars changed while bedrooms remained untouched. Parents learned a new routine that no one ever wants to experience. They memorized police phone numbers. They repeated descriptions so often they could speak them without emotion. Height. Weight. Hair color. Last known clothing. Distinguishing marks. The words became mechanical because allowing emotion into every conversation would have made surviving impossible. Yet somewhere else, another family was beginning exactly the same nightmare. Then another. Then another. California in the late 1970s was a place defined by movement. The freeways never truly slept. They connected beaches to suburbs, suburbs to industrial neighborhoods, and cities to deserts stretching beyond the horizon. Millions of journeys happened every day without consequence. One man transformed those same roads into hunting grounds. He blended perfectly into the traffic around him. That anonymity became one of his greatest weapons. Drivers rarely remember the vehicles traveling beside them. They remember accidents, flashing lights, road construction. Everything else disappears almost immediately from memory. A white van. A brown sedan. A pickup truck. They become part of the landscape, invisible because they are ordinary. He relied on that. He depended on ordinary appearances. Nothing about the first impression suggested the brutality hidden behind closed vehicle doors. Nothing warned that a routine offer of transportation concealed hours of unimaginable violence. By the time investigators began recognizing patterns, too much time had already passed. Too many roads had been traveled. Too many crime scenes had disappeared beneath weather and traffic. Too many families had begun asking questions without answers. Even the discovery of bodies did not immediately reveal the full horror waiting beneath the surface. They appeared miles apart. Different counties. Different jurisdictions. Different investigators. Different reports. Each discovery felt isolated until similarities slowly emerged like shapes rising through heavy fog. Young males. Extreme violence. Bodies abandoned near roadsides, embankments, or isolated areas accessible from major highways. The pattern was impossible to ignore once enough pieces finally existed. But patterns always become clearer after enough people have already suffered. The man responsible possessed an unsettling ability to appear ordinary in everyday life. Those who encountered him casually could have seen nothing more than another working adult navigating California's endless roadways. Conversations were normal. Smiles appeared when expected. There was no visible sign announcing the darkness hidden beneath that carefully maintained surface. History has repeatedly shown that some of the most dangerous offenders are not those who appear frightening at first glance. They are the ones who do not. Behind routine conversations and familiar routines existed a capacity for calculated cruelty that investigators would later struggle to fully comprehend. The violence described during the investigation revealed crimes that extended far beyond murder alone. Victims endured prolonged abuse before their lives were taken, leaving detectives, forensic specialists, and prosecutors confronted with scenes that remained difficult to discuss even years later. Those details would eventually fill thousands of pages of investigative reports. Court transcripts. Photographs sealed inside evidence boxes. Interviews conducted late into the night. Every document represented another attempt to understand not only what had happened, but how one individual could continue offending across such a vast region for so long without being stopped. The answer was never simple. It involved fragmented investigations, missed opportunities, limited communication between agencies, the vulnerability of young victims who often disappeared without immediate urgency from authorities because many were initially believed to be runaways. Each factor alone might not have protected a killer. Together, they created enough darkness for him to keep driving. And while the highways remained crowded with ordinary people chasing ordinary lives, another journey was already beginning somewhere under the California night sky. Another teenager stood beside a road. Another vehicle approached from the distance. Its headlights grew brighter. The engine slowed. The passenger door unlocked. For a brief moment, the scene looked almost comforting. A ride. A chance to escape the long walk ahead. A stranger willing to help. No one watching from a passing car could have imagined that within minutes, another name would quietly begin its journey toward a missing person report. Another family would soon experience the unbearable silence between hope and grief. And another piece of one of America's most disturbing serial murder investigations would fall into place without anyone realizing it. The freeway kept moving. Traffic never stopped. Neither did the killer. California had always sold itself as a place where dreams could begin again. By the late 1970s, postcards showed endless beaches washed in golden sunlight, rows of towering palm trees, and freeways stretching toward horizons that promised opportunity. To millions of Americans, Southern California represented freedom. It was where young people believed they could escape small towns, difficult families, or uncertain futures. It was a place where reinvention seemed possible simply by crossing a state line. But beneath that polished image existed another California, one that rarely appeared in travel brochures. It was a California built on constant movement. The highways never rested. Day and night, rivers of steel flowed through Los Angeles, Orange County, and the neighboring communities. Trucks carried freight toward distant cities. Office workers rushed through morning traffic before sunrise. Families packed station wagons for weekend vacations. Teenagers thumbed rides along freeway entrances, believing someone would eventually stop. The roads connected nearly everything. They also made it painfully easy to disappear. Unlike smaller towns where strangers attracted attention, Southern California had become a landscape of anonymity. Every day brought thousands of new faces arriving from different states, different countries, and different backgrounds. Apartment buildings filled with tenants who barely knew the people living next door. Neighborhoods expanded faster than communities could form. People crossed paths without learning each other's names. It was possible to spend years surrounded by millions of people while remaining almost completely unknown. For someone looking to hide in plain sight, there were few better places. The region itself seemed designed around automobiles. Long before smartphones, GPS navigation, or surveillance cameras became part of daily life, every destination depended on the road ahead. The freeway system threaded together dozens of cities, creating one vast metropolitan area that seemed endless from behind a windshield. Drivers often spent hours traveling from one county to another without giving much thought to the invisible jurisdictional lines beneath their tires. Police departments, however, thought about those lines every day. Each city maintained its own investigators. Each county kept separate records. Communication between agencies depended on phone calls, mailed reports, and personal relationships rather than computerized databases. Information moved far more slowly than the people driving across California's highways. A missing teenager reported in one city might never immediately appear on the desk of an investigator working 40 miles away. That delay mattered. Sometimes, it mattered more than anyone realized. The social climate of the late 1970s added another layer of vulnerability. America was experiencing economic uncertainty, changing family dynamics, and increasing numbers of young people leaving home. Some ran away to escape abuse. Others sought adventure. Some simply believed life elsewhere had to be better than the one they knew. California became a destination for many of them. Bus stations welcomed teenagers carrying little more than backpacks and hope. Some arrived with enough money for only a few meals. Others expected to find work within days. When those plans failed, survival became an hour-by-hour calculation. Food, shelter, transportation, trust. Every decision carried consequences. Many discovered that asking strangers for help was no longer a choice but a necessity. Hitchhiking, while already recognized as risky, remained surprisingly common. Young travelers stood beside freeway entrances with handwritten signs naming distant cities. Drivers stopped for countless reasons. Some simply wanted company during a long drive. Others remembered being young themselves and offered rides out of kindness. Most encounters ended without incident. Those ordinary experiences created a dangerous illusion. Because hundreds of safe rides happened every day, it became easier to believe the next one would also be safe. Predators understood that illusion. A smiling driver behind a rolled-down window rarely inspired immediate fear. Not at first. Parents worried, of course. Newspapers occasionally published stories warning about the dangers of accepting rides from strangers. Schools repeated familiar advice about personal safety. Yet reality often overpowered caution. A teenager stranded 20 miles from home after dark faced a practical problem before a philosophical one. Walk for hours. Or accept help. Many chose the second option. Few imagined that one decision lasting only seconds could become irreversible. The victims who would later become linked to the investigation did not share identical lives. They came from different neighborhoods, different family situations, and different backgrounds. Some maintained close relationships with parents. Others struggled inside homes marked by conflict or instability. Several had histories of running away, while others simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite those differences, they shared one tragic characteristic. They were vulnerable. Predators rarely select victims at random. They look for opportunity. Someone alone. Someone unlikely to receive immediate attention. Someone whose disappearance might initially be explained away as another runaway choosing not to return home. That assumption would haunt investigators in the years ahead. Missing person cases involving teenagers frequently began with uncertainty. Officers often had to determine whether a young person had voluntarily left home or faced genuine danger. Families insisted something terrible had happened. Authorities sometimes believed the teenager would return within days. Many eventually did. Some never returned. Every hour lost during those early stages allowed critical evidence to fade. Witnesses forgot details. Vehicles disappeared into traffic. Surveillance footage, where it existed at all, was routinely erased. Footprints vanished beneath weather. Time quietly worked against every investigation. Southern California's geography amplified those challenges. Urban neighborhoods blended into industrial districts before giving way to mountains, deserts, and isolated stretches of undeveloped land. A driver could leave a crowded city street and reach a deserted roadside within a relatively short time. The transition felt almost surreal. One moment surrounded by traffic. The next completely alone. For investigators, that landscape presented endless possibilities where evidence could be hidden. For families, it became impossible not to imagine every empty canyon, every dirt road, every abandoned lot as another place where answers might wait. The public remained largely unaware that multiple disappearances could be connected. Most news reports focused on individual victims. A missing teenager here. An unidentified body there. A separate investigation somewhere else. Without modern databases linking information instantly, patterns emerged only after patient detectives began comparing details by hand. Even then, certainty came slowly. The similarities were unsettling but incomplete. The victims were young males. Several had been traveling alone. Many were last seen near major roadways. Bodies that were recovered often appeared close to freeways or in locations accessible by vehicle. Still, coincidence could not immediately be ruled out. California was enormous. Thousands of crimes occurred every year. Connecting cases required more than instinct. It required evidence. While investigators searched for answers, everyday life continued uninterrupted for nearly everyone else. Children attended school. Businesses opened each morning. Couples planned weddings. Families gathered for birthdays. Rush hour traffic filled every freeway exactly as it had the day before. The ordinary rhythm of life concealed extraordinary violence unfolding just beyond public awareness. That contrast would become one of the defining features of the entire case. Nothing about the surrounding world appeared unusual. The danger existed not in abandoned buildings or isolated forests but within the familiar landscape people crossed every day. A busy highway. A gas station. A freeway entrance. A parked van. Places that felt ordinary until viewed through the lens of what investigators would eventually uncover. As months passed, detectives from different jurisdictions found themselves asking increasingly similar questions. Why were so many young men disappearing? Why were bodies appearing in different counties? Was one offender responsible, or were multiple criminals operating independently? No one possessed enough information to answer with confidence. Every new discovery raised additional questions rather than resolving existing ones. The investigation slowly expanded beyond individual crimes toward something far larger, though few realized how large it would eventually become. Behind the scenes, forensic science remained limited compared to modern standards. DNA profiling had not yet become an investigative tool. Detectives relied heavily on fingerprints, blood typing, fibers, witness statements, tire impressions, and painstaking interviews. Every physical clue demanded careful preservation because there would be no future technology capable of magically solving the case decades later. Mistakes carried permanent consequences. Evidence lost was often evidence lost forever. Investigators worked long hours with maps spread across conference tables, marking recovery sites with colored pins. Slowly, distances between crime scenes began revealing geographic relationships invisible in written reports alone. Roads connected everything. The freeways were no longer simply transportation routes. They appeared increasingly central to the crimes themselves. Whoever committed them understood Southern California remarkably well. He moved confidently between counties. He selected locations that delayed discovery. He avoided drawing unnecessary attention. Most chilling of all, He appeared capable of blending seamlessly into the endless flow of traffic surrounding him every single day. Outside the investigation rooms, no one could point to a face and say with certainty that evil had just driven past them. The killer looked ordinary. He occupied the same roads as families returning from vacations, construction workers heading home after long shifts, students driving to school, and couples enjoying quiet evenings together. That ordinary appearance became a shield stronger than any disguise. Because monsters, most people believed, were supposed to look like monsters. This one never did. And as California entered another warm summer, beneath skies that seemed impossibly bright above highways crowded with ordinary lives, the distance between the hunter and his next victim continued to shrink with every passing mile. Every victim carried a name before becoming a case number. Before investigators pinned photographs onto evidence boards, before reporters counted bodies and newspapers searched for headlines that could explain the growing horror spreading across Southern California, these young men belonged to families, neighborhoods, classrooms, and circles of friends. They laughed at private jokes, argued with their parents, dreamed about futures they believed were still waiting somewhere beyond the next birthday. Some imagined careers. Some wanted independence. Some simply hoped tomorrow would be easier than today. History often remembers serial murder investigations through the identity of the offender. The killer's face appears on magazine covers. His background is dissected in documentaries. His nickname becomes part of popular culture. The victims deserve something different. They deserve to be remembered as people whose lives existed long before they crossed paths with the man who ended them. Most were young. Some were still teenagers. They stood at that uncertain stage between childhood and adulthood, where every decision seemed capable of changing the course of an entire life. The late 1970s offered possibilities that felt limitless to many young Americans. Southern California, in particular, promised opportunity wrapped inside warm weather and endless highways. Music poured from car radios. Surfboards rested against garage walls. High school football games filled Friday evenings with cheering crowds. Shopping malls became gathering places where teenagers wandered for hours without buying much of anything. Life felt ordinary. Until it wasn't. Among the young men who would eventually be linked to William Bonin's crimes were boys from remarkably different backgrounds. Some came from stable homes where parents carefully planned family dinners and expected everyone to be home before dark. Others had experienced years of conflict, instability, or abuse that pushed them toward the streets long before they were emotionally prepared to survive there. Those differences mattered during their lives. They mattered very little to the man searching for his next victim. He did not look for perfect people. He looked for opportunity. A teenager standing alone. Someone waiting beside a road. Someone carrying a backpack. Someone who appeared uncertain about where they were going. Someone who believed accepting help was safer than remaining where they were. That vulnerability became the common thread connecting lives that otherwise had little in common. For many parents, raising teenagers meant accepting a constant balance between protection and freedom. Sons wanted independence. They borrowed bicycles, spent weekends with friends, explored neighborhoods without adults watching every step. Arguments over curfews were almost universal. Doors slammed. Apologies followed. Families moved forward. No one imagined that an ordinary disagreement could become the last conversation they would ever have. In more than one household, parents would spend years replaying final moments inside their memories. The hurried goodbye before school. The forgotten jacket. The argument over cleaning a bedroom. The reminder to be home before dinner. Tiny moments that once felt insignificant slowly became treasured memories because they were the last ordinary pieces of a life interrupted without warning. Several victims had histories of running away from home, a reality that complicated early investigations. During the late 1970s, runaway teenagers were not uncommon. Some fled abusive households. Others struggled with family conflict, poverty, or personal identity. Many believed life somewhere else would offer more acceptance than the homes they left behind. The streets rarely delivered on those promises. Instead, they introduced new dangers almost immediately. Food became uncertain. Shelter depended on strangers. Trust became both necessary and dangerous. Every choice carried consequences that could not always be predicted. A ride offered by someone appearing friendly might mean reaching the next city safely. Or it might become the final decision of a young life. For families searching for missing children, uncertainty often proved even more painful than confirmed loss. Hope refused to disappear completely. Every unidentified teenager mentioned in the news demanded another phone call. Every rumor spread through neighborhoods forced another exhausting search. Parents visited police stations carrying recent photographs worn soft around the edges from constant handling. Some walked through hospitals hoping someone had simply forgotten a name. Others waited beside telephones deep into the night because missing children occasionally came home. Hope, even fragile hope, became impossible to abandon. Friends experienced a different kind of grief. Teenagers rarely expect mortality to enter their daily lives. They assume tomorrow will arrive because it always has. When one friend suddenly disappeared, classmates initially searched for simple explanations. Maybe he had gone away. Maybe he was staying with relatives. Maybe he would return Monday morning smiling as though nothing unusual had happened. Days passed. Then weeks. Eventually an empty desk stopped feeling temporary. Teachers continued lessons. School bells continued ringing. Life continued moving forward even while unanswered questions remained frozen in place. That quiet absence often became more unsettling than loud tragedy. An unused locker. A yearbook photograph. A birthday no longer celebrated. Communities slowly realized that something larger than isolated disappearances might be unfolding. Fear spread cautiously. Parents became more protective. Curfews arrived earlier. Neighbors reminded children never to accept rides from strangers. Teenagers rolled their eyes at advice they had heard countless times before, unaware that adults repeated those warnings because genuine danger now existed far closer than anyone wanted to admit. Yet even increased caution could not eliminate vulnerability entirely. Young people still needed transportation. Some still traveled alone. Some still believed kindness outweighed risk because, most of the time, it did. Predators depend upon that expectation. One particularly heartbreaking aspect of the investigation involved the identification of victims whose families had already spent weeks or months living with uncertainty. Detectives often carried impossible responsibilities. They knocked on front doors knowing they might permanently alter the lives waiting behind them. A mother opening the door could sometimes recognize the truth before a single word had been spoken. Uniforms rarely arrived carrying good news. The silence that followed confirmation became impossible to forget. Neighbors remembered curtains closing. Friends remembered bicycles left untouched in front yards. Entire streets seemed quieter afterward, as though ordinary conversations instinctively lowered themselves out of respect for grief too large to describe. Some families chose to speak publicly, hoping another parent might recognize warning signs before another child disappeared. Others withdrew almost completely from public life, protecting their sorrow from cameras and newspaper headlines. There was no correct way to endure such loss. Every family carried it differently. As investigators assembled timelines, another painful reality emerged. Several victims had vanished under circumstances that initially appeared completely unrelated. One disappeared while hitchhiking. Another after leaving home. Another while traveling through Southern California. Different stories. Different cities. Different families. The only shared ending lay hidden from view until detectives connected the evidence. That realization transformed isolated tragedies into something almost unimaginable. A single offender had moved through countless ordinary days while leaving devastation scattered across multiple communities. The victims never knew one another. Their families were strangers. Yet they would forever become connected through one investigation that none of them had ever chosen to join. Looking back decades later, it becomes easy to see only statistics. 14 murder convictions. More suspected victims. Countless investigative files. Numbers create distance. They compress individual lives into figures that seem almost abstract. But every number represented a bedroom once occupied, a favorite meal, a birthday remembered in family photo albums, holiday gatherings where someone would forever remain missing from the group photograph. Parents often describe grief as something that changes shape rather than disappearing. Birthdays continue arriving. Graduations occur without the child who should have been there. Grandchildren who might have existed remain only imagined possibilities. Time moves forward. Love does not. For investigators, maintaining emotional distance was often necessary simply to continue working. They documented evidence carefully, photographed crime scenes methodically, and interviewed witnesses repeatedly because professionalism demanded precision. Yet professionalism never erased humanity. Many detectives later acknowledged that the youth of the victims affected them deeply. These were boys who should have been planning futures instead of becoming forensic investigations. Their stories deserved answers. Their families deserved truth. Even when truth proved almost unbearable. The highways where so many journeys began remained crowded every day, filled with people chasing ordinary lives. Most drivers never realized they were passing locations forever connected to unimaginable loss. A stretch of asphalt looked no different from any other. An exit sign offered directions to another neighborhood. A roadside embankment appeared empty beneath the California sun. Only investigators understood how much sorrow those familiar landscapes concealed. Every recovered victim strengthened their determination to stop whoever remained responsible. Because somewhere beyond the growing collection of photographs, maps, and case files, another young man was still living an ordinary life, completely unaware that he had already entered the orbit of a predator who viewed human lives not as dreams waiting to unfold, but as opportunities waiting to be taken. The beginning of a tragedy is rarely obvious. There is usually no warning that a normal moment is about to become the last normal moment of someone's life. No dramatic sign in the sky. No visible line separating safety from danger. Most people move through their days believing the next hour will resemble the previous one. For the young men who became victims of William Bonin, their final moments began not with something extraordinary, but with ordinary circumstances. A journey. A conversation. A decision made in a matter of seconds. And somewhere along the highways of Southern California, those seconds became the point where their lives crossed paths with someone who would later be identified as one of America's most notorious serial killers. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, William Bonin moved through Southern California's vast network of roads with a familiarity that investigators would later find deeply disturbing. He understood the rhythm of the region. He knew that thousands of people traveled alone every day. He understood that young people searching for transportation were often forced to depend on the kindness of strangers. To the outside world, he appeared ordinary. That ordinary appearance became part of what allowed his crimes to continue. There was no obvious difference between him and countless other drivers on the freeway. He could stop at a gas station, drive through a neighborhood, or sit in traffic surrounded by families and commuters without attracting attention. The same roads that connected millions of people also provided him with anonymity. That was the environment in which his crimes unfolded. The victims were often encountered during moments of vulnerability. Some were hitchhiking. Some were young men who had left home. Some were simply in places where they became accessible to him. The circumstances varied, but investigators later recognized a pattern. Bonin targeted young males who could be isolated and controlled. The danger was hidden behind a familiar human interaction. A stranger offering assistance. A driver appearing willing to help. A moment when trust overcame caution. For many people, accepting a ride from someone they did not know was not unusual during that era. Hitchhiking remained a common part of American culture despite growing awareness of its risks. Young travelers stood near roads carrying bags, waiting for someone heading in the same direction. Most drivers who stopped were not dangerous. Most offered help without harmful intentions. That reality made predators like Bonin especially difficult to recognize. He did not need to force every opportunity. He relied on the fact that people naturally searched for kindness in others. Once a victim entered his vehicle, the situation changed completely. The car, something associated with transportation and freedom, became a place where control was taken away. Investigators later described a pattern of extreme violence that revealed careful planning and a willingness to repeatedly harm others. The crimes were not isolated moments of sudden anger. They reflected a pattern that developed over time. Bonin's actions demonstrated preparation. He selected victims. He created opportunities. He continued despite the increasing risk of discovery. The investigation would later reveal that he was not always acting alone. Several young men became involved with him in different capacities, creating another disturbing aspect of the case. The existence of accomplices showed how Bonin was able to influence others and draw them into his criminal behavior. For investigators, understanding that network became one of the most challenging parts of the case. A single offender was already difficult enough to identify. Multiple people connected to the crimes created additional questions. Who knew what? Who participated? Who remained silent? The answers would eventually become important pieces of the prosecution's case. But before investigators could build those connections, families were still living through uncertainty. While Bonin continued his crimes, loved ones of missing teenagers were experiencing a different kind of nightmare. They did not know where their sons were. They did not know whether they were safe. They did not know whether they should continue hoping for a phone call or prepare themselves for devastating news. Every missing person case began with questions. Where did he go? Who saw him last? Was he trying to contact someone? Could someone have information that had not yet been shared? Families searched because searching was the only thing they could do. They called friends. They spoke with police. They shared photographs. They waited. Meanwhile, the person responsible continued moving through the same world as everyone else. This contrast became one of the most haunting elements of the case. The victims' families were trapped in moments of fear and uncertainty. The offender continued daily life. He interacted with people. He maintained routines. He existed in ordinary spaces while carrying knowledge of crimes that investigators had not yet fully connected. That separation between appearance and reality made the investigation even more difficult. When detectives later examined the timeline of Bonin's crimes, they discovered that the killings occurred across a relatively short but intensely violent period. Between 1979 and 1980, a pattern emerged that revealed a predator becoming increasingly active. Each crime created another opportunity for evidence to exist. A witness. A vehicle description. A conversation remembered later. A physical clue overlooked at first. But those pieces were scattered across different locations, handled by different agencies, and separated by time. The investigation was fighting against fragmentation. Every jurisdiction had only part of the story. A missing teenager in one community. A recovered body in another. A suspicious vehicle report somewhere else. Only when those pieces were brought together did the full picture begin to emerge. The victims themselves became the center of that effort. Their names, photographs, and histories transformed an investigation from a search for a criminal into a search for justice. Detectives were no longer simply asking, who committed these crimes? They were asking, who were these young men, and how did someone manage to take their futures away? That question carried enormous weight. Because behind every investigation file was a person who had once been alive, someone whose family expected to see them again. The violence committed against them was not simply a statistic. It was a collection of stolen futures. A collection of families permanently changed. A collection of communities forced to confront the frightening reality that danger could exist in familiar places. As the number of victims increased, investigators began to understand that they were not searching for someone responsible for a single crime. They were searching for someone who had turned the roads of Southern California into a hunting ground. And the most terrifying realization was this. The man they were looking for was not hiding in some distant location. He was traveling the same highways as everyone else. He was passing through the same intersections. He was surrounded by the same crowds. While families waited for answers, while detectives searched for connections, and while the public remained largely unaware of the scale of what was happening, William Bonin continued driving. The freeway carried him forward. And with every mile, the investigation moved closer to the moment when the hidden pattern would finally become impossible to ignore. By the time investigators began to understand the scope of what had happened, the crimes of William Bonin had already left a trail stretching across Southern California. The geography of the case was unsettling because it reflected the geography of everyday life. These were not crimes confined to one isolated town or one forgotten corner of the country. They unfolded across a region filled with millions of people who were going to work, visiting friends, taking vacations, and traveling the same highways where a predator was searching for victims. The roads that represented movement and possibility had become connected to disappearance and fear. For the families of the victims, however, the case did not begin with maps or statistics. It began with absence. A bedroom that remained unchanged. A chair that stayed empty. A telephone that no longer brought the expected news. When someone disappears, time changes meaning. The first hours are filled with urgency. Every possibility remains open. A person may have lost their way. They may have needed help. They may have chosen to leave temporarily and will return when they are ready. Families hold on to those possibilities because hope is often the only thing standing between them and despair. But as days become weeks, uncertainty becomes its own form of suffering. The families connected to the freeway killer investigation experienced that painful transition. They moved from searching for someone who was missing to confronting the possibility that their loved one had become a victim of something much darker. For investigators, every recovered piece of evidence represented both progress and heartbreak. A discovery could answer one question while creating another. A body could provide a family with the truth they desperately needed while also confirming the outcome they had feared. There is a unique cruelty in cases involving serial murder. The investigation may eventually identify a suspect, but justice cannot restore what was taken. It cannot return a son to his parents. It cannot give a teenager another chance to experience adulthood. It cannot repair the futures that disappeared alongside the victims. The work of investigators became a race against time. They were searching for patterns. They were studying locations. They were reviewing reports. They were speaking with witnesses who remembered small details that had seemed meaningless when they first occurred. A vehicle seen near a location. A conversation that felt ordinary. A person who behaved in a way that seemed unusual only after the larger picture became visible. Criminal investigations often depend on these fragments. A single clue rarely solves a complex case. Instead, the truth emerges slowly through accumulation. One piece connects with another. A timeline begins to form. Separate incidents begin revealing themselves as chapters of the same story. The William Bonin investigation followed that difficult path. The victims had been found in different places, and many cases initially appeared separate. Law enforcement agencies were forced to look beyond individual crimes and recognize a broader pattern. This required cooperation, communication, and the willingness to consider that several tragedies might have a single cause. That realization changed everything. A missing person investigation is already difficult. A serial murder investigation is something far more complex. Detectives were no longer looking only backward, trying to understand what had happened. They were also looking forward. Would there be more victims? Was the offender still active? Could someone else disappear before they found him? Those questions created enormous pressure. The longer the offender remained unidentified, the greater the fear that another family could receive the same devastating phone call. The case also revealed the challenges of investigating crimes committed against vulnerable young people. Many victims lived outside traditional support systems. Some had histories that made authorities initially consider explanations other than foul play. A teenager who left home was sometimes assumed to have chosen independence rather than become the target of violence. That assumption created dangerous delays. For families, the suggestion that their child had simply left could feel unbearable. They knew the personality of the person they loved. They knew the habits, fears, and dreams that existed behind the missing person report. A photograph attached to a police file represented an entire human being. A childhood. A personality. A future. The investigation slowly forced authorities to confront uncomfortable questions about how missing young people were treated and how quickly their disappearances received attention. The Freeway Killer case became not only a search for one criminal but also a reflection of weaknesses in how information was shared and how vulnerable individuals were protected. Meanwhile, Bonin's confidence continued to grow. The repeated nature of the crimes suggested that he believed he could continue without being caught. Each successful offense reinforced the illusion that he remained invisible. The same factors that had helped him initially, anonymity, fragmented investigations, and the vulnerability of his victims, appeared to protect him. But every crime also created risk. Every interaction created witnesses. Every movement left traces. Criminals often believe they control the story until investigators begin reconstructing it from the outside. The offender sees individual moments. Investigators see patterns. A killer may remember a single night. Detectives eventually examine hundreds of details surrounding that night. A license plate. A location. A witness statement. A timeline. A connection that seemed impossible until one person noticed something everyone else had overlooked. That process was already beginning. Although the public did not yet know his identity, the circle around William Bonin was slowly becoming smaller. The investigation gained momentum through persistence rather than one dramatic discovery. Detectives continued reviewing information, following leads, and comparing details between cases. They were building a picture of the person responsible before they had a name. They knew they were searching for someone who understood how to appear ordinary. Someone comfortable approaching strangers. Someone capable of maintaining a normal public image while committing horrifying crimes in private. That contradiction became central to understanding him. The most frightening offenders are sometimes not the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who can disappear into normal life. A neighbor. A coworker. A person passing through a crowd without attracting attention. The idea that such violence could exist behind an ordinary appearance disturbed communities across Southern California. People began looking differently at familiar places. A highway entrance was no longer just a highway entrance. An abandoned roadside area was no longer simply empty land. A stranger offering help was no longer automatically viewed as harmless. Fear changed everyday behavior. Parents warned children more carefully. Travelers became more cautious. Communities paid closer attention to missing person reports. The case had moved beyond individual crimes and entered public consciousness. But for the families of the victims, public attention was never the point. They were not seeking headlines. They were not interested in the notoriety surrounding the killer. They wanted their sons remembered. They wanted their lives acknowledged beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Because the danger of cases like this is that the offender's identity can overshadow the people he harmed. The name William Bonin became widely known. The names of his victims required effort to preserve. That imbalance is common in true crime history. The person responsible becomes a subject of endless discussion, while the people who suffered become reduced to a list. But before the investigation became a story about a killer, it was a story about young lives interrupted. Every victim had a future that should have continued. Every family had plans that should have unfolded. Every disappearance represented a moment when an ordinary life was suddenly and permanently changed. The search for justice was therefore not only about catching a criminal. It was about restoring dignity to those whose voices had been taken away. As detectives continued following the trail, they moved closer to the breakthrough that would finally expose the man behind the disappearances. The pattern was no longer hidden. The connections were becoming clearer. The highway that had once provided anonymity was beginning to work against him. Every mile he had traveled. Every decision he had made. Every victim he had left behind. All of it was becoming part of a story investigators were determined to finish. And soon, the man who believed he could remain invisible would discover that the same ordinary world that allowed him to hide would eventually become the place where he was found. The first sign that something was deeply wrong did not arrive as a complete picture. It came in fragments. A report filed in one city. A discovery made in another. A family searching for answers. A detective noticing that certain details refused to disappear. At the beginning, each event existed inside its own small world. A missing person case belonged to one department. A recovered body belonged to another investigation. A frightened family belonged to another community. The connections were there, but they remained hidden beneath distance, paperwork, and the limitations of an era before instant information sharing. Southern California was vast enough to hide almost anything. The freeways stretched across hundreds of miles, connecting neighborhoods that looked similar while remaining separated by invisible boundaries. A person could disappear in one county and become a mystery somewhere else. A vehicle could travel through several jurisdictions before anyone realized it had crossed from one investigation into another. For investigators trying to understand what was happening, the landscape itself became part of the challenge. The locations where victims were discovered were not dramatic places. They were often ordinary parts of the Southern California environment. Areas near roads. Open spaces. Places where vehicles could stop briefly and leave without drawing attention. That ordinary quality made the discoveries even more disturbing. The world continued around them. Cars continued moving. People continued their daily routines. Yet investigators stood in places where someone's life had ended and tried to reconstruct what had happened. Every scene contained questions. Who was this person? How did they arrive here? When did this happen? Who was responsible? In the early stages, answers were incomplete. Investigators had to work with what they could see and what they could prove. They examined locations carefully, documented evidence, and attempted to understand the circumstances surrounding each victim. Every detail mattered because there was no guarantee that another piece of the puzzle would ever appear. The victims' identities were often among the most important discoveries. A person without a name becomes an unanswered question. A person with a name becomes someone who can be returned to their family. Behind every identification was a painful process. Detectives searched through missing person reports, contacted families, compared descriptions, and tried to determine whether the person before them matched someone who had been desperately searched for. For families waiting for news, identification brought a complicated kind of heartbreak. The uncertainty ended. But the loss became real. Many families live in a strange space after someone disappears. They imagine countless possibilities because the alternative is too painful to accept. They picture their loved one somewhere else, perhaps needing help, perhaps waiting for the right moment to return. A confirmed identification removes that uncertainty forever. It replaces questions with grief. As more victims were connected to the investigation, detectives began noticing similarities that suggested these were not isolated tragedies. The young ages. The circumstances surrounding the disappearances. The locations where remains were found. The pattern was slowly taking shape. But recognizing a pattern and proving one are two different things. Investigators needed evidence strong enough to connect crimes that had occurred across different locations and involved different victims. They needed to establish that these were not separate acts committed by unrelated offenders. That required patience. It required cooperation. And it required detectives willing to look beyond the boundaries of their own cases. The investigation became a process of comparison. Reports were reviewed again. Old information was examined with new perspective. Details that once seemed insignificant gained importance when viewed alongside other cases. A missing persons file that had seemed isolated months earlier suddenly appeared connected to a larger story. A location that seemed random began to fit a pattern. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to move toward each other. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the offender's ability to operate within ordinary society. There was no obvious warning sign attached to him. No public behavior that immediately revealed what he was capable of. That meant investigators were not searching for someone who looked dangerous. They were searching for someone who blended in. The contrast between appearance and reality became one of the defining elements of the investigation. A person could commit horrific acts and then return to normal routines. They could speak with neighbors. They could interact with strangers. They could exist among people who had no idea what they were hiding. That realization created fear because it challenged a common belief: that danger announces itself. In this case, it did not. The investigation also revealed the importance of small details. In complex criminal cases, evidence rarely appears as one perfect answer. Instead, it accumulates slowly. A witness remembers something. A report reveals a similarity. A timeline becomes clearer. A connection that once seemed impossible begins to make sense. Detectives often describe this process as assembling a puzzle. But unlike a puzzle with a picture on the box, they did not know what the final image would look like. They had to discover the picture while building it. Each victim provided another piece. Each recovered clue moved them closer. Each unanswered question created another reason to continue. The pressure was enormous because the investigation was not only about solving crimes that had already occurred. It was also about preventing future ones. When a serial offender remains unidentified, every day carries uncertainty. Investigators know that the person responsible may still be active. They know another victim could appear before they understand the full scope of the danger. That possibility changes the entire nature of the work. The past and the future become connected. Every discovery becomes both an answer and a warning. By this point, the name Freeway Killer had begun appearing in connection with the case. The nickname reflected the disturbing relationship between the crimes and the roads of Southern California. The highways that connected millions of people had become associated with fear and disappearance. But behind the nickname were real victims. Real families. Real lives. For investigators, the goal was never simply to identify a criminal who had gained public attention. The goal was to restore truth to the people who had lost everything. The discovery phase of the investigation represented a turning point. What had once appeared to be a series of unrelated tragedies was becoming something much larger. The evidence suggested a single offender. The patterns suggested planning. The growing number of connected cases suggested urgency. The question was no longer whether these crimes were connected. The question became, who was responsible? And somewhere within Southern California, the person investigators were searching for continued living a life that appeared ordinary. He was no longer hidden behind complete anonymity. The pieces were moving closer. The roads that had once helped conceal his actions were slowly becoming the paths that would lead investigators toward him. The investigation into the Freeway Killer case was not solved by one dramatic moment. There was no single piece of evidence that suddenly revealed the entire truth. Instead, the path toward William Bonin unfolded slowly, built from persistence, cooperation, and the painful examination of details that had once seemed disconnected. For detectives, the process required something more difficult than simply finding evidence. It required recognizing meaning inside chaos. A missing teenager. A recovered victim. A witness who remembered a vehicle. A report filed months earlier. Each piece existed separately until someone placed them together and saw the shape forming beneath the surface. That was the challenge of investigating a serial offender. The crimes were not occurring in one contained location. They were spread across a region where millions of people lived and traveled every day. Southern California's size became both a hiding place for the offender and an obstacle for those trying to find him. The distance between cases created confusion. The similarities created suspicion. The investigators had to determine where one ended and the other began. As detectives reviewed information connected to multiple victims, they began to understand that the circumstances were not random. There were repeated elements that suggested planning and familiarity. The victims were young males. Many were vulnerable. Several had disappeared from places where they could easily encounter a stranger. The locations where victims were found suggested that the offender understood how to move through the area without immediately attracting attention. The picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. The person responsible was not acting impulsively. He appeared comfortable. He understood opportunity. He understood risk. And he had managed to continue despite the growing possibility of discovery. That realization changed the urgency of the investigation. A single homicide is already a tragedy. A pattern of homicides creates a different kind of fear. It means the offender may not stop. It means the next victim could already be at risk. Investigators had to consider every possibility while working with limited information. They needed to identify a person they could not yet name, understand a method they were still discovering, and prevent future crimes while solving those already committed. The pressure was immense. At the center of everything were the victims. The investigation was built around them. Every photograph represented a life interrupted. Every report represented a family searching for answers. Every location represented a final chapter that detectives were trying to understand. The public often remembers investigations through the moment of arrest or the final courtroom verdict. But much of the real work happens quietly before those moments. Long hours. Repeated interviews. Reviewing documents. Comparing timelines. Following leads that sometimes ended nowhere. Investigators had to accept uncertainty every day. A promising lead might disappear. A witness might remember only a small detail. A theory that seemed convincing might collapse under closer examination. Progress was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small steps forward. One of the difficulties surrounding the case was understanding the victims' movements before their disappearances. Investigators needed to reconstruct their final known locations and determine how they may have crossed paths with the offender. That process required examining the last moments of ordinary lives. A person leaving a location. Someone seen walking nearby. A planned destination never reached. A conversation that seemed meaningless until after the fact. The tragedy of these cases often lies in how normal everything appeared beforehand. There was no way for the victims to know what was coming. There was no way for witnesses to recognize the importance of moments that seemed completely ordinary. A stranger approaching. A vehicle stopping. A brief interaction. Only later would those moments become pieces of evidence. As investigators continued their work, they also faced the challenge of public fear. The phrase freeway killer created widespread attention because it represented something deeply disturbing, the possibility that danger could exist in familiar places. The roads people used every day had become connected to a frightening series of crimes. Parents worried about children traveling alone. Young people became more cautious. Communities paid closer attention to reports of missing teenagers. The case changed how many people viewed the simple act of accepting a ride from someone they did not know. But fear alone could not solve the investigation. Evidence had to. And evidence required time. The breakthrough would eventually come from the combination of multiple factors rather than one isolated discovery. Information from witnesses, statements from individuals connected to the crimes, and physical evidence gradually narrowed the possibilities. The investigation began moving from questions about an unknown offender toward questions about a specific person. That transition is one of the most important moments in any criminal investigation. At first, detectives are searching through darkness. They are trying to understand what happened. Later, they begin focusing on who could have made it happen. The difference between those two stages is enormous. The first is a search for answers. The second is a search for accountability. As the evidence accumulated, investigators began moving closer to William Bonin. The man who had appeared invisible was becoming visible. The driver who had moved through California's highways unnoticed was beginning to leave a trail that could no longer be ignored. The same confidence that allowed him to continue committing crimes eventually became part of what exposed him. Serial offenders often believe repetition creates safety. They believe that because they escaped detection before, they will escape again. But every repeated action creates another opportunity for mistakes. Every interaction creates another possible witness. Every crime leaves behind another connection. The investigation into William Bonin demonstrated that truth often moves slowly, but it continues moving. The victims who had been separated by geography were finally being connected. The families who had been searching in isolation were becoming part of a larger story. The detectives who had been following individual cases were now pursuing a single offender. The invisible pattern was becoming clear. And soon, the investigation would reach the moment when suspicion became evidence, when questions became accusations, and when the man behind the disappearances would finally be forced to face the consequences of what he had done. The road that had carried him away from his crimes would eventually lead investigators directly to his door. A serial murder investigation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with questions. Questions that have no immediate answers. Questions that follow detectives home after long shifts. Questions that remain waiting on desks beneath stacks of reports and photographs. Who is doing this? Why these victims? How is the offender choosing them? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, will there be another? By the time investigators began seriously examining the possibility that multiple killings were connected, the case had already become a complicated web of missing person reports, recovered victims, witness statements, and incomplete information. The crimes had crossed geographical boundaries, creating a situation where no single department initially possessed the entire picture. Each agency had been looking at its own piece of the puzzle. Now they had to understand the whole image. The investigation required detectives to abandon the assumption that every crime existed alone. That was not always easy. Law enforcement agencies naturally focus on their own jurisdictions. A detective assigned to one case has a responsibility to that victim, that family, and that community. But serial offenders do not respect those boundaries. They move freely through cities and counties. They do not care which police department receives the report. They do not care which agency investigates the aftermath. Their actions create connections that investigators must discover. The Freeway Killer case forced detectives to look beyond individual files and recognize a pattern hidden across Southern California. The victims were not random names on separate reports. They were connected by circumstances. They were connected by timing. They were connected by the methods used against them. The investigation became an effort to rebuild the offender's movements backward. Detectives asked questions about where victims were last seen. Who had spoken with them? Where they might have traveled? What opportunities existed for someone to approach them? Every answer created more questions. Every possibility had to be tested. During this period, investigators faced another major challenge: understanding the person they were searching for. They were not looking for someone who had committed one crime and disappeared. They were searching for someone who had repeatedly taken risks while maintaining an ordinary public presence. That required a different kind of investigation. Traditional assumptions about criminals were not always useful. The offender did not fit the image many people expected. He was not a stranger hiding in an obvious place. He was someone who could interact with others without immediately creating suspicion. That reality complicated the search. Investigators knew that whoever was responsible likely understood how to avoid attention. He had managed to move through communities without drawing enough suspicion to stop him. The question became, how? The answer involved opportunity. The victims often represented people who were easier to isolate. Young men who were traveling alone. Individuals who may not have had immediate support nearby. People whose disappearances could initially be explained in ways that delayed recognition of a larger danger. That vulnerability became a critical part of understanding the crimes. Investigators also had to confront uncomfortable realities surrounding missing person cases. Not every disappearance received the same immediate response. Some young people were labeled as runaways. Some were assumed to have left voluntarily. Sometimes those assumptions slowed the urgency of the search. For families, this could be devastating. They knew their children. They knew their habits. They knew when something was wrong. But convincing others of that urgency could be difficult when the missing person was young and had a history of leaving home. The investigation into the freeway killer highlighted the importance of taking every missing person case seriously, especially when vulnerable individuals were involved. Behind every report was a person whose future mattered. As detectives continued their work, they examined possible suspects and attempted to determine whether any existing information pointed toward a specific individual. At first, the number of possibilities was overwhelming. Southern California was home to millions of people. A person could disappear into that population easily. Investigators had to narrow an enormous field. They looked at behavior. They examined connections. They followed leads. Some possibilities appeared promising at first but eventually disappeared under closer examination. This is one of the realities of major criminal investigations that is often overlooked. For every successful lead, there are many that go nowhere. Detectives spend countless hours pursuing possibilities that never become answers. They interview people who provide no useful information. They investigate claims that cannot be confirmed. They follow paths that end in dead ends. Those failures are not wasted time. Each eliminated possibility brings investigators closer to the truth. But emotionally, the process is exhausting. Especially when victims continue to be discovered. The pressure increased with every passing day. A solved case means justice for someone who has already suffered. An unsolved case means the possibility of another victim. That uncertainty affected everyone involved. Detectives carried the responsibility of stopping the offender. Families carried the pain of waiting. Communities carried the fear that someone dangerous was still nearby. Meanwhile, investigators began examining the possibility that the offender had assistance. This was another unusual and disturbing element of the case. William Bonin was not simply a lone figure operating completely apart from others. Information gathered during the investigation revealed connections to individuals who became involved in the crimes. That raised additional questions. How many people knew what was happening? How did someone convince others to participate? Why did they remain silent? Understanding those relationships became an important part of the investigation because it revealed more about how the crimes were carried out and how the offender maintained control. The search was no longer only about identifying a killer. It was about understanding the entire network surrounding him. Every investigation reaches a moment when the unknown begins to become specific. The list of possibilities becomes smaller. The evidence begins pointing in a particular direction. The person who once seemed impossible to find begins leaving behind a recognizable trail. For the freeway killer investigation, that moment was approaching. The pieces were still scattered. The answers were still incomplete. But detectives were beginning to see the outline of the person they were searching for. The highways that had once provided endless escape routes were becoming something else entirely. They were becoming a map. A record of movement. A connection between crimes that had once appeared separate. Every road led somewhere. Every decision left consequences. And slowly, investigators were following those roads toward one man. William Bonin. The closer investigators moved toward the truth, the more complicated the case became. Finding a suspect was only the beginning. Turning suspicion into evidence was the real challenge. In criminal investigations, a name alone means very little. Detectives can have instincts. They can recognize patterns. They can believe they are looking in the right direction. But belief cannot secure a conviction. The evidence has to speak. And in the freeway killer investigation, that evidence had to overcome years of uncertainty, multiple crime scenes, different jurisdictions, and a suspect who had spent a long time appearing ordinary. As investigators continued examining the crimes, William Bonin began to emerge as someone who required closer attention. The picture forming around him was not based on one single event. It came from accumulated information. Statements. Connections. Timelines. Physical evidence. The pieces were slowly moving together. But before that happened, investigators had to work through the confusion created by the offender's ability to blend into everyday life. One of the most difficult aspects of pursuing a serial offender is understanding that the person responsible does not always behave like the public expects. People often imagine dangerous individuals as obvious. They expect warning signs. They expect suspicious behavior that everyone should have noticed. But many offenders survive because they appear normal in ordinary situations. They go to work. They speak with neighbors. They maintain routines. They interact with people who have no idea what they are capable of. That contradiction made the search more difficult. Investigators were not looking for someone who stood apart from society. They were looking for someone who existed inside it. The investigation also required examining the relationships around Bonin. The involvement of accomplices created another layer of complexity. A person who commits crimes with others leaves behind different kinds of evidence. There are conversations, shared experiences, conflicting accounts. People who may eventually decide to cooperate with investigators for different reasons. Those relationships can reveal information that a single offender might never provide. They can expose hidden details. They can explain how crimes were planned and carried out. They can show how someone gained influence over others. For detectives, understanding these connections became essential. A case involving one offender requires answering one central question. Who did this? A case involving multiple people requires many more. Who participated? Who encouraged? Who knew? Who remained silent? Every answer creates another responsibility. As investigators continued building the case, they also had to deal with the passage of time. Time can be both helpful and harmful. It can allow witnesses to come forward. It can reveal connections that were not obvious initially. But time can also erase memories. It can destroy evidence. It can make reconstruction more difficult. The detectives working the case understood that every delay mattered. Some families had already waited months for answers. Some had spent years wondering what happened. The investigation was not simply a professional obligation. It carried a human cost. Behind every piece of evidence was someone who deserved justice. That motivation pushed investigators forward even when progress was slow. The search for Bonin also demonstrated the importance of persistence. Many major criminal cases are not solved because of one extraordinary moment. They are solved because investigators continue asking questions after others might have stopped. They review information again. They reconsider assumptions. They follow details that appear insignificant. They listen carefully when someone remembers something they once dismissed. In a case involving numerous victims, even a small piece of information can become the link that changes everything. Eventually, investigators began focusing more directly on Bonin. The man who had once existed only as an unknown figure connected to disappearances was becoming a specific person with a history, relationships, and a trail that could be examined. The investigation shifted. The question was no longer simply, who could be responsible? It became, how much can be proven? That difference marked a critical stage. Detectives began collecting information that would later become central to prosecution. They worked to establish connections between Bonin and the crimes, building a timeline and examining evidence that supported their theory. The process required careful preparation. A criminal case cannot rely on public suspicion. It cannot rely on fear. It cannot rely only on the belief that someone seems capable of committing a crime. It must demonstrate facts. The investigation had to show not only that Bonin was connected to the victims but also how those connections were established. That required patience. It required precision. And it required investigators to continue working despite the emotional weight of what they had uncovered. The more they learned about the crimes, the more disturbing the reality became. The victims were not strangers without stories. They were young people whose lives had been interrupted. They were sons, friends, classmates, and members of communities that had been waiting for answers. The investigation existed because their lives mattered. As the case developed, public attention increased. People wanted to know who was responsible. Families wanted justice. Communities wanted reassurance that the danger had ended. But investigators remained focused on the work in front of them. The goal was not simply to arrest someone. The goal was to build a case strong enough to withstand examination. Every detail mattered. Every statement mattered. Every piece of evidence mattered. Because the final question would not be whether people believed Bonin was responsible. The question would be whether the evidence could prove it. By June 1980, the investigation had reached a critical stage. The years of uncertainty, the scattered reports, and the unanswered questions were beginning to converge. The man who had moved through Southern California believing he could remain hidden was now approaching the moment when hiding would no longer be possible. The highways that once gave him freedom had carried him into the center of the investigation. The victims who had once seemed disconnected had become the reason the truth was emerging. And the detectives who had spent months following fragments were finally approaching the breakthrough that would change the case forever. The search was almost over. But the fight for justice was just beginning. The final stages of an investigation are often the most delicate. For months, sometimes years, detectives work through uncertainty. They follow possibilities, eliminate theories, and search for a connection that may or may not exist. But once a suspect begins to emerge, the nature of the investigation changes. The danger is no longer only failing to find the person responsible. The danger is moving too quickly. A suspect must be investigated carefully. Every assumption must be challenged. Every piece of information must be examined. Because justice depends not only on finding the right person, but on proving the truth beyond doubt. By the summer of 1980, investigators examining the Freeway Killer case had reached a point where William Bonin was no longer simply another name among many possibilities. Information gathered from different sources had begun creating a much clearer picture of his connection to the crimes. The investigation that had once stretched across multiple counties and countless unanswered questions was becoming focused. The person who had seemed invisible was beginning to leave a visible trail. One of the major turning points came through information provided by people connected to Bonin. Statements from individuals who had knowledge of his activities helped investigators understand more about the crimes and the relationships surrounding them. These accounts were significant because they provided something investigators had been searching for from the beginning: a connection between the unknown offender and the evidence. For a case involving multiple victims, witnesses can become essential. They can provide context that physical evidence alone cannot reveal. They can explain movements, relationships, and events that occurred away from public view. But witness information must also be handled carefully. Investigators must consider motives. They must compare statements. They must separate facts from speculation. Every statement becomes another piece of the larger picture. The investigation into Bonin required exactly that kind of careful examination. Detectives were not simply collecting accusations. They were building a timeline. They were reconstructing events. They were attempting to understand how a man could have carried out such crimes while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary life. That contrast remained one of the most disturbing elements of the case. To many people who encountered him, Bonin did not appear to be someone capable of extraordinary violence. There was no public warning that revealed what investigators would eventually uncover. This reality created one of the most difficult questions in cases involving serial offenders. How can someone hide such a dark reality behind everyday behavior? The answer is rarely simple. People who commit serious crimes can sometimes separate different parts of their lives. They may present one image to the outside world while concealing another. They may follow routines, interact socially, and appear unremarkable while committing acts that are completely hidden from those around them. For investigators, understanding that contradiction was important. It explained why the case had taken so long to develop. It explained why communities had not immediately recognized the danger. And it reinforced the importance of evidence over appearance. As the investigation continued, authorities prepared for the next step: the arrest. But an arrest was not the conclusion. It was the beginning of a different battle. The courtroom would eventually determine whether the evidence was strong enough to establish responsibility. That meant every investigative decision mattered. Every interview. Every recovered item. Every documented connection. A mistake could create doubt. A missing detail could become a weakness. The investigators understood the importance of building a case that told the complete story. Not only the story of the offender. The story of the victims. The story of the investigation. The story of how separate tragedies became connected. The story of how a person who believed he could remain hidden was eventually identified. In June 1980, that investigation reached its decisive moment. William Bonin was arrested. For families who had spent months living with uncertainty, the arrest represented a significant change. The person they believed responsible was no longer an unknown figure moving freely through the world. There was now a name. A face. A person who could be held accountable. But an arrest could not erase the pain that came before it. It could not return lost time. It could not restore the futures that had been taken. For investigators, the work continued. The arrest created new responsibilities. Evidence had to be reviewed. Cases had to be prepared. The connections between Bonin and the victims had to be presented clearly. The investigation moved from the streets and highways of Southern California into legal proceedings where every detail would be examined. The public had questions. Families had questions. And the justice system demanded answers. How many victims were there? Who else was involved? What evidence connected Bonin to the crimes? Could the prosecution prove what investigators believed they had discovered? Those questions would define the next stage of the case. The investigation had finally identified the man behind the disappearances. But understanding the full extent of what happened would require another long process. A process involving prosecutors, defense attorneys, witnesses, investigators, and families who had waited years for the truth. The road toward justice had begun. The same highways that once represented uncertainty now represented something different. They represented the path that investigators had followed. The path that connected victims. The path that led them to the person responsible. For a long time, William Bonin had relied on distance, anonymity, and silence. But distance could be measured. Anonymity could disappear. And silence could eventually be broken. The investigation had found its answer. Now the justice system would decide what that answer meant. For months, the investigation existed in a place between certainty and doubt. Detectives knew something terrible had happened. They knew multiple young men had lost their lives. They knew the circumstances surrounding the cases shared disturbing similarities. But knowing a pattern existed was not the same as knowing who was responsible. A criminal investigation is a search for truth, but truth does not always arrive all at once. It often appears slowly, through fragments that seem meaningless until they are placed together. A name. A witness. A statement. A detail remembered at the right moment. The breakthrough in the William Bonin case did not come from one dramatic discovery that instantly solved everything. Instead, it came through the gradual collapse of the distance between investigators and the man they were searching for. For a long time, Bonin had benefited from the very things that made Southern California such a difficult place to investigate crime. Its size. Its movement. Its anonymity. Millions of people traveled the same roads every day. Thousands of vehicles passed through the same areas. A person could disappear into the flow of traffic and become just another face among millions. That environment had allowed him to continue. But the same environment also created opportunities for mistakes. Every person he encountered was a potential witness. Every location he visited left behind possibilities. Every connection he formed created a risk. Serial offenders often believe repetition makes them safer. They believe that because they have avoided detection once, they can avoid it again. But repetition creates patterns. Patterns create evidence. And evidence creates accountability. As investigators continued their work, they began receiving information that changed the direction of the case. People connected to Bonin provided details that helped authorities understand the scope of his actions and the relationships surrounding him. These statements were critical because they offered investigators something they had struggled to obtain: a direct link between Bonin and the crimes. The investigation was no longer built only on similarities between cases. It was beginning to focus on a specific individual. That transition marked a major turning point. Before this moment, detectives were searching through uncertainty. After this moment, they were building a case. The difference was enormous. A theory can guide an investigation. Evidence can end one. Investigators now had to carefully examine every piece of information connected to Bonin. They needed to determine what could be verified, what could be supported, and what could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The pressure was intense. A mistake could affect the families waiting for justice. An overlooked detail could create doubt. Every decision carried consequences. The victims remained at the center of the investigation. Their names represented more than a criminal case. They represented families who had spent months wondering what happened. They represented parents who had waited for answers. They represented young lives that had ended before they had the chance to become something more. For detectives, solving the case meant more than identifying a suspect. It meant telling the truth about what happened. It meant giving families the answers they deserved. It meant making sure the victims were remembered as people rather than simply evidence in a criminal trial. As the evidence surrounding Bonin continued to develop, investigators learned more about the way he had operated. The crimes were not random acts committed without thought. They reflected planning, opportunity, and a disturbing understanding of how to exploit vulnerable people. This realization made the investigation even more urgent. The person they were pursuing was not simply connected to past crimes. He represented a continuing danger until stopped. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. Because the possibility remained that someone else could become a victim. The investigation also revealed another troubling aspect of the case. Bonin had not always acted alone. The involvement of accomplices created a complicated picture of influence and participation. It forced investigators to examine not only what Bonin had done, but how others had become involved. How did they become part of his world? What did they know? When did they realize what was happening? Those questions became important as authorities worked to understand the full extent of the crimes. The breakthrough was not only about finding a suspect. It was about uncovering the complete story. By June 1980, investigators had gathered enough information to move forward. The man who had remained hidden behind ordinary appearances was now directly connected to the investigation. William Bonin was no longer simply a person of interest. He was the focus of a major criminal case. The arrest that followed represented a moment of enormous significance. For investigators, it was the result of months of work. For families, it represented the first real movement toward justice. For communities, it meant that the person connected to a series of terrifying crimes was finally in custody. But even after an arrest, the emotional reality remained complicated. An arrest does not bring someone back. It does not undo the pain of loss. It does not restore birthdays missed, conversations unfinished, or futures that would never happen. For families, justice would always exist alongside grief. The investigation had reached a critical point, but the process was far from finished. A courtroom would eventually determine what could be proven. Evidence would be examined. Witnesses would speak. The defense would challenge the prosecution's case. The public would learn more about the crimes that had remained hidden for so long. But before all of that happened, there was a moment when investigators finally knew they had found the person they believed responsible. A moment when uncertainty began turning into action. A moment when the endless roads of Southern California no longer represented an unsolved mystery. They represented the path that had led them to William Bonin. The investigation had found its direction. The search was over. Now the pursuit of justice would begin.